All right, all right. How's everyone doing tonight? Just hopping on real quick. We're doing a short paper tonight. It's on a paper that's titled Mutiny on the Slave Ships, and the author is Lorenzo J. Greene, published by Clark Atlanta University. The paper, it's a full paper, to be honest. And I see we have the pro-black perspective is here in the chat. Peace to the pro-black perspective. Make sure you guys are tuned in to the pro-black perspective on Sundays. There's a nice little segment that he's doing, The Enemies Within. So make sure to check it out. So yeah, we're gonna read this paper tonight. My setup is, as it was last week, my setup is different this week. So we're doing things a little bit differently, but it's all good. Once you guys could hear me, just drop a 1 in the chat if you could hear me. Make sure that's good. All right. Drop a 1 in the chat if you could hear me. I might be talking to myself. No, that's fine too. So on the other side of the intro here, we will read this paper, Mutiny on the Slave Ships. All right. So just stay tuned. We'll be back in a second.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Just want to remind you guys before we get the show rolling that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku, and we are reading this paper, an old paper, called Mutiny on the Slave Ships. Make sure you guys are tuned into all the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure you let all the other hosts know that you appreciate what they do as well. That's very important, all right? And if you're here, make sure you hit the like button. I appreciate all of you. Mutiny on the Slave Ships by Lorenzo J. Greene, the excellent study of American Negro slave revolts by Herbert Aptheker, is the most recent work to revise the carefully nurtured notion of the Negro's natural docility to slavery. In his scholarly volume, however, Mr. Aptheker confines his attention to slave insurrections upon American soil. Yet these outbreaks were but the second act in the tragic drama of the Negro's continuous struggle for freedom. The first act, the bloody uprising of the slaves on board the ships bringing them to America, is yet to be written. In the following pages, an attempt will be made to portray some of the battles for freedom waged by Negroes on New England slave ships, battles which lay outside the scope of Mr. Aptheker's volume. In the more than 350 years of the slave trade to America, ships of every nationality participating in the traffic, Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, English, and American, were scenes of desperate attempts by the slaves to regain their liberty. Of the American ships involved in these insurrections, those from New England suffered most. This is not surprising, for the Puritan colonies in the 18th century were the greatest slave trading communities in America. From Boston, Salem, and Charlestown in Massachusetts, from Newport, Providence, and Bristol in Rhode Island, and from New London and Hartford, Connecticut, swift, sturdy ships took rum, bar iron, and trinkets to Africa. There, the captains bartered their goods for Negroes, whom they carried to the West Indies or to the plantation colonies of the South, and sold for rum, molasses, sugar, cocoa, or bills of exchange. The molasses and sugar were brought to New England, distilled into rum, thence transported to Africa for more slaves. Thus developed the notorious triangular slave trade, with New England, Africa, and the West Indies as its chief focal point. The profits from the slave trade were almost incredible. Seldom has there been a more lucrative commerce than the traffic in Negroes. In 1699, it was reported that 10 shillings in English goods would buy a slave in Madagascar. And early in the 18th century, the choicest West Coast slaves sold in America for £3 or £4. These slaves and others costing £5 in rum or bar iron were sold into the West Indies and in the plantation colonies at prices ranging from £30 to £88 sterling. In 1746, Joseph Maness of London made a profit of £11,200 on a cargo of slaves that cost £1,800. With gross profits sometimes as high as 1,600%, the slave trade easily became the most lucrative commerce of the 17th and 18th centuries. Before the American Revolution, it was regarded as the mainstay of New England's prosperity. So, when I think of, I'm a big basketball fan. And when I think of Bill Russell, who won 8 straight championships, I think 11 in total, in Boston with the Celtics. And I think about how he had to still eat in the back and go around back and all that kind of stuff. You understand the history there. When you think of this white boy, Mark Wahlberg, and that crime he committed against some Vietnamese or something like that back in the day, you understand. When you still today hear about Boston in sports, even with their black stars and all that kind of stuff, you understand why. Or you should understand why. They see you only one way. We got Arthur here. Arthur says, I have the world's worst reception, but I'm here. Well, I appreciate that, brother. Thanks for coming through. Daily Affirmations by Pauline is passing through. We don't often see some of you folks, Arthur Daily Affirmations during the week, but I appreciate you guys coming through all the same. Right? So this should break down to you. And again, they broke it down to you, the different parts of New England that you're supposed to be wary of. Puritan exploitation of this profitable commerce bred a wealthy merchant class whose names include some of the most prominent families in American history. George Cabot of Salem, Samuel and Cornelius Waldo, Andrew and Peter Phanuel of Boston, James Brown and his 4 sons of Providence, and George Champlin, William Ellery, and Caleb Gardner of Newport were only a few of the well-known merchants whose fortunes rested upon the slave trade. This makes me think about the ADOS group too. And just before I came on, I mean, literally a moment before, seconds before I came on, someone from ADOS was saying how ADOS or FBA was saying how, yeah, we got to get these African countries to pay us reparations. And this sister Shez Sade, who I just became aware of recently, I think through Lero on Twitter. Shez Sade says to this guy. So this guy says, nope, African tribes and African governments still exist. Caste systems always existed in Africa, and people from bottom castes of those societies were often sold off as slaves. So those people owe us reparations. We are descendants of slaves. This weird obsession with being descendants of a slave is weird to me when you just acknowledged that these slaves came from Africa. It's just strange. The African government owes reparations. And Ches Sade, you guys might know who she is, says a government that did not exist during the time of chattel slavery cannot owe reparations for chattel slavery. Put your thinking cap on. But it reminds me, that tweet reminded me of something. Like when these guys talk about their reparations claim, they attack everyone but white folks. Some of these families that came up off of the Africans in America's direct descendants, right? They're all of our descendants, but they're direct descendants. Some of these families still exist. Some of these banks that are popular exist off of slavery. But you're not going after these people. Althazar says spring break for us teachers in Texas. I understand. You spring break and you have some time. I get you. Again, like I said, thank you for coming through. I appreciate it. Make sure you guys hit the like button while you hear from me, please. Make sure you hit the like button. Right? Yeah, so that's something I never could understand. With these folks, that you're not going after the people, the descendants are still here. Oh, and by the way, a lot of y'all still mess with the church of the people who came up off of the back of your ancestors, by the way. Puritan exploitation of this profitable commerce bred a wealthy merchant class. I just read that. Interested in obtaining the greatest possible returns from their slaving activities, these merchants contrived in every way to cut the overhead costs of slave voyages. Small ships, generally ranging between 40 and 60 tons, were found most practical for the slave trade. All of them were undermanned, with crews numbering from 6 to 18 hands, including the captain and cabin boy. Cheating, kidnapping, and other sharp practices were freely indulged in. Every possible precaution was taken to prevent the slaves from revolting. Slave ships were generously equipped with pistols, muskets, cutlasses, knives, and even cannon. Guards were posted at all times to ensure against the crews being taken by surprise. The vessels were also carefully searched to make sure that no pieces of iron, wood, or other weapons were within reach of the slaves. Merchants regularly instructed their captains to transact their business on the African coast with the utmost dispatch and to be constantly on the alert against slave insurrections which might reduce or even wipe out entirely the profits of the entire voyage. The admonition of Samuel Waldo to Captain Samuel Rhodes prior to the latter's sailing for Africa in 1734 is typical. Quote, "For your safety as well as mine," he wrote, "you'll have the needful guard over your slaves, and put not too much confidence in the women nor children, lest they happen to be instrumental to your being surprised, which may be fatal." Which may be fatal. And you know, when we talk about this re-Africanization through education, through curriculum, um, I'm going to show y'all. I'm going to actually I can't show it here, but I'm going to read to you guys this tweet thread this brother put up, and it shows you how and why, or it shows you why you need to get back to your African self. In attempting to follow these instructions, the captain and crew of slave vessels made the existence of the blacks almost unbearable. In fact, the very measures taken to protect the profits of the merchants by preventing uprisings reacted to drive the Negroes into mutiny. Herded aboard ship, the slaves were crammed into the hot, stuffy holes between decks. In these compartments, only 3 feet 3 inches high, it was impossible for the slaves to sit erect. While male slaves were chained together by twos. Female slaves were unfettered, but were separated from the men by partition. You know, that's the first time I've actually read that before. To augment the carrying capacity of the ship, the Negroes were forced to lie spoon fashion, each Negro fitting into the curve of the other's body. I did not know that. Couple one of you had known that. I'm curious to see if you guys had known that was the case. As the slaves lay naked on the rough planks, the rolling of the ship frequently rubbed the flesh off prominent parts of their bodies, leaving them writhing in blood and mucus. Blood and mucus. Okay. When the hatches were closed and battened down at night, or when storms or attack from hostile vessels made it necessary to close the gratings and airports, many of the slaves died of suffocation. Food and water often ran low or even ran out, causing indescribable torment and sometimes death from thirst and hunger. Loathsome diseases, yaws, syphilis, fevers, ophthalmia, dropsy. Well, I haven't heard the word dropsy since I was back home kid. My grandmother used to use that a lot. Dropsy, seasickness, and the dreaded white and bloody fluxes added to the misery and mortality of the slaves on the terrible Middle Passage. Sailors making their daily rounds in the stinking holes frequently unshackled dead slaves from the living and threw their bodies to the sharks that followed in the wake of the vessel. The terrible suffering of the Negroes on these vessels, the Puritans justified on the high ground that slavery was an act of mercy by which the slaves could be brought to salvation. You know, a lot of you Negroes believe that shit today too. Because I grew up in the church. I grew up in an Anglican church at that. And it is a damn shame, quite frankly, that was the case. That we were in these Anglican church. These guys in the chat. Arthur Reserve says, man, just ignore those ADOS FBA dumbasses. They are like gnats. I agree with that. Yeah, I do agree with that. Marcus McGee is here, y'all. Marcus McGee says they're crazy. If we all just thought as one people, we could have the world forget reparations. LOL. Bobby Wright is also here, y'all. Y'all say what's up to one another. Bobby Wright says, Habari Gani Koku. Peace to you, Bobby Wright. Thanks for coming through. Arthur says, and by the way, you guys check out Arthur's music. Check out his YouTube channel. He's looking for reggae drummers, reggae bass players. You guys link up with the brother if you like his work, especially. Arthur says, do you have a database of those who are interested in pushing Pan-African curriculum forward? Do you know each of their talents and how they can contribute? Do you have a list of ongoing projects? I have a list of ongoing projects for sure. I don't have a database of people as yet. Arthur goes on to say, do we know the needs for each of these projects? Are we working to source those needs? Are we expanding these networks? Yeah, I'm doing all of those things. Keyword is I'm doing those things. Like I said, during Shoot the Breeze, when that prompt came up as to what you're doing locally, I started to meet with some education majors on the college campus where I work, but the pandemic has kind of messed it up. People are coming back now, but there's still the issue of of congregating in spaces, et cetera, et cetera. But as things start to open up and we start to put this time period behind us with the pandemic, yeah, you're gonna actually learn about the stuff I'm doing in person for real, right? And hopefully others who are around will channel people towards what I'm trying to do in the real world right now. Um, to continue, the reading of our ancestors here and to know how they were huddled and all that kind of stuff is really triggering. You know what I mean? It's really triggering. But we will continue. The terrible suffering of the Negroes on these vessels, the Puritans justified on the high ground that slavery was an act of mercy by which the slaves could be brought to salvation. Unless the heathen were acquainted with the gospel, eternal misery would be his lot in the afterlife. Therefore, any suffering that the slaves might experience either on the slave ship or in slavery was more than compensated for by their quote unquote fortunate delivery from a life of idolatry and savagery. For this reason, a slave trading Rhode Island elder could piously rejoice as he beheld his slave vessel come into port, that an overruling providence had been pleased to bring to this land of freedom another cargo of benighted heathen to enjoy the blessings of a gospel dispensation. You know, and I'm not making this about the religious debate. I think we had a lot of that last year. I'm not making it about that in this episode tonight, but when I do have a chance to speak on it, I do like to speak on it. You have to really divorce yourself from good sense to still be a part of these religions. You have to really, I'm not saying you can't be religious, but these particular flavors, right? These non-African spirituality, these particular, you have to really put in some work to divorce your mind from the truth of what these religions have wrought against the African. And I'll leave it there. The reaction of the Negroes to their condition aboard the slave ship showed that they did not generally share the conviction of those who would lead them into salvation through slavery. Driven to desperation by their wretchedness, the slaves seized every opportunity to escape enslavement or to end their suffering. Many refused to eat and were sometimes forced to do so after having their teeth broken or their lips seared by hot coals. Others committed suicide. But the most dramatic protests were the frenzied mass efforts of the Negroes to win their freedom through violence. Biding their time, they frequently rose up against their captors in determined attempts to kill the crew, seize the vessel, and return to Africa. You hear that? Kill the crew, seize the vessel, and get your black ass back to Africa. By the way, let me just say one more thing about this religion thing, right? If it in fact was the case that you were enslaved, right, so that you can receive this gospel, wouldn't the God of that gospel appear to you in that time and say, and comfort you and say, yeah, this is the right way to go? After you've gone through the suffering and you've converted, wouldn't the God of that gospel now give you the same benefits as he gave this European? But I digress. Let's see, we have a few more people here. BB Rodriguez is in the room. BB Rodriguez is saying, "Good evening, Coco and chat. I appreciate you coming through, BB." Tito District is here. My mind ran on Tito District recently. Tito District is here saying, "Greetings, everyone." Greetings to you, Tito District. Thanks for coming through. Make sure you guys hit the like button too while you're here. Bobby Wright says, if African people in America knew that song Amazing Grace was written by John Newton, a slave trader, yeah, they would stop singing the shit. I used to think that. I used to think that they would stop singing it. But folks are so steeped in this nonsense, they just won't give it up at this point. It's like cocaine or something, heroin or crack or something. Arthur says, many know and don't care. He says the first interview Onitase had on his channels was with me. And we talked about religion. We can't focus on it. It is too deeply ingrained. Yeah. The thing about that religion is that that's what's going to trip us up. That's what's going to, like, if you listen to Oni's recent show on Sunday, the brother was talking some stuff that most people don't have the stomach for. In fact, I was even surprised the brother was saying it so clearly. And I appreciate his candor, you know. But if you ain't out here killing for your freedom, what are you really doing? And the religious are the ones who are going to want to hold your hand back. In fact, they're the ones who are going to run and go tell the people you're coming. The religious are going to do that. The religious are the sellouts. To continue, biding their time, they frequently rose up against their captors in determined attempts to kill the crew, seize the vessel, and return to Africa. In this bloody but circumscribed theater of action, the revolting slaves were generally at a disadvantage. The crew, although outnumbered by the Negroes, was fully armed, organized, disciplined, and under authoritative leadership. You see that line right there? And I'm sorry I'm sorry I'm not showing you guys the paper that I'm reading like I usually would. But that line right there is exactly what that should be one of our guiding thoughts. The way the crew carried on. The crew, although outnumbered by the Negroes, was fully armed, organized, disciplined, and under authoritative leadership. If only we could take that and apply that to our situation right now. Malcolm X talked. Every popular, every beloved vocal leader we've had has talked about we're just disorganized, we're undisciplined, right? This is what we need to start taking up. To continue, the crew also had the advantage of strategic position for it, controlled the decks and superstructure of the ship. On the other hand, the slaves were unorganized, undisciplined, and united only in their insatiable desire for liberty. And we've completely lost even the third one. We're still unorganized, we're still undisciplined, and now we're just not even united. They were unarmed, shackled, and weakened by confinement. Pieces of iron, wood, and their chains were their only weapons. Moreover, in the event of an uprising, they could easily be dispatched by the gunfire of the crew as they climbed on the deck. But these bozal, or raw Negroes, feared neither their captors nor death, and in spite of the slender possibilities of success, struck time and again in maniacal fury for their freedom. Sometimes the slaves gained their objective. More frequently, the firearms of the crew prevailed, and after desperate struggles, the slaves were repulsed, but only after casualties had been inflicted on both sides. I see BB likes that line that I read. The crew, fully armed, disciplined, and organized. Let me scroll back up. There was a couple more points that were made. And by the way, Arthur Zer mentions that interview he did with Oni. You guys go back on Oni's channel, the Pro Black Perspective, and check out that interview. Like I said, check out Arthur Zer's music. If any of you guys have the skills, the time, etc., to help that brother put out his project, you guys make sure check him out, hit him up. B.B. Rodriguez says the woman being by diseased peen. I would guess so. Yes. Arthur says we have to accept Muslims, Christians, Rastafarians, atheists, and agnostics. I don't think the problem is the acceptance. I think once you're Black equals African and you understand our shared plight and our shared destiny, we don't have a problem accepting you. The problem becomes when these Black equals African folks put that Muslim, Christian, Rastafarian, atheist, and agnostic ahead of their Blackness, right? Like we've seen this in history. We had Negroes, these religious Negroes ran and told Master what was coming. Daily Affirmation by Pauline says, LOL. I don't know why. 4. Bobby Wright says that Christianity is like drugs. Maybe that's why she's laughing. B. Rodriguez says 75% of all West Africans trafficked were Muslim. Arthur says educated Christians will tell you that these people perverted the true religion. That's true. Educated Christians would tell you that. That's true. But the problem is they're still Christian, educated or not. He says they will tell you about Augustine and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and all that stuff. Tito District says, my new schedule this year has been so hectic. Glad to be back here learning and edifying. I'm glad to have you back. Tito District, I put it out there a little while ago, a few weeks ago, that, and actually you were in my mind when I said it too. You and this other sister whose name is escaping me right now, but I'd like to see more sisters. In fact, B.B. Rodriguez could be one of those sisters too. I'd like to see more sisters, especially for Shoot the Breeze on the panel. Like we've had a couple of weeks here where we've been asking, where are the sisters to give their outlook on something. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. Tito District says organization is key. B. Rodriguez again says the crew fully armed, disciplined, and organized with a sad face. Arthur says the Jesuits are the best at killing for Christ. The Muslims know jihad. The religious know best how to kill for their God. Absolutely right. Not for Black Eagles African people. BB Rodriguez says Koku facts. It hurts so much is at stake. Right? Arthur says under authoritative leadership, we are too many different egos. No one submitted to any authoritative organization. We will talk for decades if we don't come under an authoritative structure. I 100% agree with you about that. 100%. B. Rodriguez also agrees. Arthur says perhaps we need to go into our UNIA branches and rise into positions of leadership. Instead of inventing a new structure, resurrect the old organizations. I have no problem with that. Arthur also says we are a rudderless people, too much talent wasted running around in circles by ourselves. Amen. Amen, Ra, as a matter of fact. BB says Arthur is spot on. We in danger, nobody is mobilizing. BB says being casual causes you to become, being causal causes you to become a causality. Oh, sorry, a casualty. That's a Les Brown quote. Tito District says, shoot the breeze is a staple. I'll work up my nerve soon. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you considering what I just asked. I do. And I'm glad that shoot the breeze is a staple for you as well. Whew. Yeah, this this reading has admittedly gotten to me Because when I think of the ancestors, I actually think of like my children. And I think of them being huddled and starved to death and suffocated. Nah, that's a tough one for me. So what I'm going to do here, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to take a station ID break. I'll be back on the other side to finish off the second half of the paper. I want to thank you guys for being here. Again, please hit the like button, drop a comment. I'll read them live on the air. We'll be back right after these messages.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is W.E.B with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
That's the question. What are you going to do? What would you have done on during these mutinies on slave ships? What would you have done? In the meantime, I'm going to continue reading the second half of the paper. Ships of all the slave trading communities of New England experienced these insurrections. Carroll tells of a successful slave insurrection aboard a New Hampshire vessel commanded by Captain John Majors of Portsmouth. The Negroes revolted, killed the entire crew, and seized both the schooner and its cargo. On October 5th, 1764, came a report from Charleston, South Carolina, telling of the death of Captain Millar of the ship Adventure. When Millar and all but one of his crew died of illness off the coast of Africa, 2 white men assumed control of the ship. While the vessel lay at anchor with her slaves, continued the report, the natives came off, barbarously murdered the white men, and plundered the whole cargo except for 2 slaves. I like how this white boy says barbarously. Ooh. Oh, boy. In 1764, a Boston court listened to a tale of mutiny, murder, and Negro insurrection from William Priest of the slave ship Hope, belonging to Messrs. Forsays of New London, Connecticut. Priest was charged with murdering his skipper, Captain Gould, as the Hope lay at anchor on the Senegal River in Africa. According to Priest's testimony, the chief mate then assumed command and later took on a cargo of slaves. En route from Africa to the West Indies, the Negroes mutinied. In the ensuing struggle, 2 members of the crew and 8 slaves were killed. The ship put on to Puerto Rico, with the Spanish authorities charging that it was illicitly trading with their possessions, confiscated both vessels and slaves. In the same year, conflicting reports filtered into Connecticut concerning Captain Faggott. I'm not making that up. The dude's name is Captain Faggott, Faggott, right? Master of a brig owned by the Forseys of New London. One version said that Faggott had been, this paper is actually kind of a fun paper. One version that said that Faggott had been killed when his slaves revolted at Goree off the coast of Africa. So Faggott was killed by his slaves. According to the second report, The slaves freed themselves of their chains and attacked the ship at night, killing the captain and 2 members of the crew. Because of the much larger slave trade of Massachusetts, insurrections on board her ships were more numerous. On January 28, 1731, an English newspaper reported that Captain Jump of the Massachusetts schooner William and all but 3 of his crew had been killed in a slave uprising off the coast of Africa. 2 years later, in 1733, Captain Moore of a Massachusetts slaver reported that at midnight on June 17th, his ship was attacked by natives on the Gambia River. The battle, Moore related, lasted till dawn. When the wind and tide finally drove the ship close to the shore, the natives tried to board her, but were finally driven off after a hard fight, during which 1 member of the crew was killed. In 1761, slaves aboard the Boston ship Thomas, commanded by Thomas Day, revolted, broke through the hatches, and set upon the crew. Only after the leader had been killed and others wounded was the insurrection put down. A more celebrated case was that of the Jolly Bachelor, a slave ship belonging to Peter Fanuel, his brother-in-law John Jones, and Captain Cutler of Boston. While taking on slaves in the Sierra Leone River in March 1742, the vessel, according to George Burchell, was attacked and captured by the natives. In the fight, Captain Cutler and 2 of his men were killed. The Negroes stripped the vessel of its rigging and sails, freed the slaves in the hold, and abandoned the ship. 1 month later, Burchell and others refitted the vessel, appointed one Charles Wickham master, and brought it into Newport. There, the vessel was libeled and sold for about £3,000. 2/3 of this amount went to the Fanuel and Jones families, 1/3 to Burchell. Marcus McGee is funny. He said, "Type 1 if you laughed at Captain Faggot." If I could right now, I'll type 1 for you. Arthur says, "I tell you what pissed me off recently. It's the white family that took a black embryo, impregnated it with black sperm, and carried it to term. And they're claiming it's their baby." Wow, I didn't hear about that. He said, "That got my blood hot. They're fucking playing with us." But I don't even want to talk about it. I just want to build something so that the next generation has hope. I feel you on that. You guys type 1 if you also laughed with me and Marcus McGee that this Captain Faggot was killed by some slaves, some Africans who were enslaved back in the day. Something to notice in this reading, in all seriousness, if you really peep what's going on here, especially in this last burst of stories of insurrections, it was the natives, it was Africans on the continent who were doing this uprising. And that's going to tie into something I'm going to talk about at the end of the reading tonight. I'm going to talk about this tweet that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to read that tweet thread to you guys because it ties into that very well. There's something we need to understand from this, right? There's something we need to understand from this. To continue. In April 1789, another uprising occurred aboard the schooner Felicity. 13 days out from Africa, the slaves revolted, killed Captain William Fairfield, and wounded several of the crew. 3 of the slaves were killed. The captain's son, who either during or after the struggle scalded himself with hot chocolate, sent his mother the following report of the uprising. Honored parent. So this is this jackass who scalded himself with hot chocolate. He's writing his ma, and he says, "Honored parent, I take this opportunity to write unto you to let you know of a very bad incident that happened on our late passage from Cape Mount on the coast of Africa bound to Cayenne. We sailed from Cape Mount the 13th of March with 35 slaves on board. The 26th day of March, the slaves rised up upon us. At 7:30, my serf father and all hands being forward, except the man at below and myself. 3 of the slaves took possession of the cabin, and 2 upon the quarter deck. Them in the cabin took possession of the firearms, and them on the quarter deck with the axe and cutlass and other weapons. Them in the cabin handed up pistols to them on the quarter deck. One of them fired and killed my honored sir, his father, and still we strove for to subdue them. And then we got on the quarter deck and killed 2 of them. One that was in the cabin was coming out at the cabin windows in order to get on deck, and we discovered him and knocked him overboard. 2 being in the cabin, we confined the cabin doors so that they should not kill us. And 3 men went forward and got the 3 that was down there and brought them aft. And there being a doctor on board, a passenger that could speak the tongue, he sent one of the boys down and brought up some firearms and powder. And then we called them up, and one came up and he called the other, and he came up. We put them in irons and chained them, and then the doctor dressed the people's wounds, they being slightly wounded. Then it was 1 o'clock, they buried my honored parent. I scalded myself with hot chocolate, but now I am able to walk again. We have sold part of the slaves, and I hope to be home soon. This jackass spilled hot chocolate on his balls, it seems, right? Because if you scald yourself with hot chocolate, but now you're able to walk again, what's the correlation? You have to scald yourself in the balls. Ships from Rhode Island, the leading slave trading colony, suffered most frequently from these uprisings. One of the worst insurrections was attended with complete success for the slaves. On June 1st, 1730, Captain George Scott in the sloop Little George sailed from the Guinea coast with a cargo of 96 slaves, 35 of whom were men. 6 days later, the slaves slipped out of their shackles and at 4:30 in the morning attacked the ship. Breaking through the bulkhead, they gained the deck where they were confronted by the watch of 3 men. These, the slaves, quickly dispatched and pitched overboard. Terrified, the captain, 3 men and a boy, sought refuge in the cabin below, where the slaves promptly imprisoned them. One of the sailors attempted to fashion a bomb by filling 2 bottles with gunpowder to be thrown among the slaves. This stratagem was thwarted by a Negro who dropped an axe on the bottle just as the sailor lighted the fuse. The explosion set fire to a keg of powder, blew open the cabin door, raised the deck, discharged all except 1 musket, and seriously injured both the captain and bomb maker. Determined to wipe out the crew, the slaves loaded one of the carriage guns and fired it down the scuttle where the sailors were imprisoned. According to the captain, the blast blew the scuttle all to pieces, but no one was injured. For several days, the slaves controlled the ship, while the captain and the remainder of the crew, armed with muskets, defended themselves below. Some time later, the cabin boy, impelled by hunger, ventured upon deck, whereupon the slaves promptly clapped him in irons. Finally, the Negroes guided the ship into the Sierra Leone River and ran it aground on a bar. After removing all the women and children, they abandoned the ship. Later, they returned with their natives in an attempt to kill the crew, but the latter successfully defended themselves with firearms. At the first favorable opportunity, the captain and the rest of the crew came upon deck, lowered a boat, and started down the river. Weak from hunger, they were finally rescued after having subsisted for 9 days on raw rice. You know this, eat raw rice, right? I see we have some more folks here. B.B. Rodriguez says 36 recorded slave trafficking voyages made between West Africa and the Caribbean from 1593 to 1880. 12 million enslaved family members took that horrendous trip. Gas Them Up is here. Gas him up. Good dude. He's been on the panel for Shoot the Breeze the last 2 weeks. If you guys haven't tuned in to Shoot the Breeze, you can always check out the playback and hear his insight as well. Peace to Gas him up, saying peace family. Bobby Wright says, I agree with the brother. Shoot the Breeze is very important to conscious growth. I learn a lot by the knowledge BMPC gives, Bitter Medicine Podcast gives. Well, as you know, I appreciate Bobby Wright a lot. And like I said, Gas Him Up came through the last 2 weeks and has added another nice dimension to it as well. So you guys who've been missing out, you should be tuning in and catch up. Gas Him Up says, wish you all the best of health and wealth. Same to you, brother. Gas Him Up says to BB, when you just gonna move to Africa and be a wife? LOL. He says, I'm joking, sister. B. Rodriguez says, Dr. Ali Missouri said of the transatlantic slave trade, the Atlantic Ocean was like a highway for nearly 300 years. Yep. Bobby Rodriguez says, I read about many of those slave insurrections you're mentioning. There were hundreds and maybe thousands of slave revolts at sea. Some ships disappeared in the Middle Passage. Right? Bibi Rodriguez says, it will grind on your stomach, raw rice. Yeah, raw rice, boy. You know things about it if you're eating raw rice. Right? But Bobby E. Wright has shown before that he's well versed in a lot of these slave revolts and slave uprisings, and I think he's a good resource to go to in the future. So, Bobby, Wright, if you haven't done so already, join the Discord. Join the Discord so we could chop it up some more about some of these things, and maybe you could give me some ideas on some episodes to do in the future. To continue, equally as disastrous was the experience of Captain Bear, master of a Rhode Island slaver. On December 4th, 1753, he had stored on board his ship at Coast Castle, Africa, a number of slaves and a quantity of gold dust. Without warning, the slaves rebelled, killing the captain. Killing the captain and all the crew except the 2 mates, who escaped by leaping overboard and swimming ashore. The ultimate fate of both vessels and Negroes is not known, to Bobby E. Wright's point. In 1753, according to Captain David Lindsay, the slaves aboard a Rhode Island ship commanded by Captain Hemblett revolted, causing him to lose his best Negroes, whatever that means. Nicholas Owen, an Englishman serving aboard a Rhode Island vessel, told of a calamity which befell a ship from that colony between 1746 and 1757. The ship had anchored off Banana Island where the captain and 5 of the crew went ashore. But Banana Island is off of Rhode Island, I'm guessing. Banana Island. Banana Island is an artificial island off the foreshore of Lagos, Nigeria. Okay. Hold on. Let me see if this is the same island he's talking about. An Englishman, so yeah, so no, it can't be the one in Lagos. There must be another one here, somewhere around Rhode Island. The ship had anchored off Banana Island where the captain and 5 of the crew went ashore. There they were captured by Negroes who later took and plundered the ship. 12 years later, Captain T. Rogers, master of a vessel belonging to Messrs. Samuel and William Vernon of Newport, was carrying a cargo of slaves from Barbados to St. Christopher in the West Indies. This tweet thread I said I'm going to read to you guys, it's about Barbados. So stay tuned for that. So from Barbados to St. Christopher in the West Indies, on the way, the slaves rose up and attempted to seize the ship. In suppressing the revolt, Rogers is said to have lost 11 male slaves. A second report said that 13 slaves jumped overboard. 1 was killed and several wounded. Far more disastrous was the voyage of Captain Hopkins, who commanded a ship belonging to the Brown brothers of Newport. In 1765, he sailed from Africa to Antigua with a cargo of slaves. On the way, sickness so depleted the crew that the captain impressed some of the slaves to help man the ship. What? But the Negroes, seizing the opportunity to gain their freedom, released some of their fellows and fell upon the crew. After a bloody struggle, the crew, outnumbered but armed with muskets, put down the rebellion after they had killed, wounded, or forced to jump overboard 80 of the slaves. In the same year, a report stated that the entire crew of a Bristol, that's Rhode Island, vessel had been killed by the slaves off the African coast. The only white survivor was a Mr. Dunfield, who escaped by being out in a boat when the uprising took place. 11 years later, the slaves aboard the Rhode Island ship Thames, taking advantage of the carelessness of the chief officer, made a desperate effort to gain their freedom as the ship lay off the Guinea coast. Armed only with staves and chunks of wood, the Negroes fell upon the crew, who sought refuge behind a barricade on the deck. After a desperate but futile 40-minute struggle to surmount the barricade, all the men slaves jumped overboard. In this manner, between 33 and 36 of the most valuable slaves were drowned. 6 slaves were picked up by townspeople, who charged Captain Clark 11 ounces of gold dust for their return. In his letter to John Fletcher of London, dated December 15, 1776, Dr. John Bell, a physician on board the Thames, graphically described the insurrection. He says, as Captain Clark has observed to you, the voyage has been attended with nothing but losses and disappointments. So to complete the whole on Friday the 8th, instead, we had the misfortune to lose 36 of the best slaves we had by an insurrection. This unlucky affront happened when there was only the boatswain, carpenter, 3 white people, and myself on board. We had 160 slaves on board and were that day let out of the deck chains in order to wash. About 2 o'clock, they began by seizing upon the boatswain, and he soon got disengaged. After receiving a wound in the breast and one under his chin, they continued to throw staves, billets of wood, etc., and in endeavoring to get down the barricade or over it for upward of 40 minutes, when finding they could not effect it, all the Fanti and most of the Accra, this is interesting. He says all the Fanti and most of the Accra men, slaves, jumped overboard. It was thought that the slaves intended to get abaft of the ship, but the current was so strong they could not reach the vessel. When all was settled, we found 32 men and boys, with 2 women are missing, the best slaves we had. There's a picture you should be putting together in your minds as you're hearing this. I continue. The woman slaves did not join in the attack. Bell asserted only because the spontaneity of the uprising had not given the men time to notify them. Had they also been involved, the doctor assured his superior, quote, your property here at this time would have been but small, end of quote. A marked decrease occurred in the number of slave insurrections on New England ships during the last quarter of the 18th century. The American Revolution ruined the slave trade in all the principal slaving states, Rhode Island, 1784, Connecticut, 1784, and Massachusetts, 1787, abolished the slave trade. Prohibition of the traffic, however, only increased the profits from a successful voyage. Therefore, many Puritan merchants continued to engage illicitly in the slave trade. Evidence of the clandestine exploitation of the traffic in Negroes is revealed in continued reports of slave insurrections aboard New England vessels. 7 years after Connecticut abolished the slave trade in 1791, Captain William Wignall of New London lost his life when his slaves revolted off the coast of Africa. 2 years after Massachusetts proscribed the trade, the insurrection of slaves aboard the Felicity took place. In 1795, a bloody encounter occurred between insurgent slaves and the crew of a Boston ship off the coast of Africa. The Negroes, 40 in number, attacked the crew, killed the common seaman, the first and second mates, and the captain, and seized control of the ship. The vessel drifted ashore near the mouth of the river Nunez, where after a bloody battle lasting almost 7 hours, another trader recaptured the ship. Because a larger number of Rhode Island merchants continued to carry on an illicit trade in Negroes, slave uprisings aboard their vessels were more frequent. In the year following Rhode Island's prohibition of the traffic, complete disaster overtook one of its vessels. In 1785, the ship left Newport for Africa. 12 months later, it was found by an English ship drifting helplessly upon the high seas. Her sails were gone, and upon her decks crouched 15 emaciated slaves. Whether the crew had died of illness or whether the Negroes had risen up, slain the captain and crew, and then attempted to steer the ship back to Africa will never be known. I like how they like to go for the alternative. Oh, it wasn't the enslaved who rose up. Perhaps the captain and perhaps all the white folks just got sick and died, right? In 1793 or 1794, several slaves lost their lives in a futile attempt to seize the Nancy, commanded by Captain Cook. Only the timely warning of a Negro cabin boy probably saved the Mary from total disaster in 1796. Let me read that again. Only the timely warning of a Negro cabin boy probably saved the Mary from total disaster. Some of the slaves, having freed themselves from their leg irons while in the hold, planned to attack the crew with them when they came on deck. Although the sailors were forewarned, the slaves fought savagely. Only after 2 of them had been drowned, 1 shot dead, the 6 slaves trampled to death, and 4 Negroes wounded was the uprising put down. So, what book you think that Negro cabin boy was reading from? As late as 1807, Captain Joshua Vial, the Rhode Island master of the ship Nancy, belonging to John Phillip and John Gardner of Charleston, South Carolina, reported several slave uprisings on his vessel. During one of these attacks, 3 slaves were killed and 1 jumped overboard. Another outbreak occurred when a slave attempted to seize Vial as he was pouring molasses in his victuals. I haven't heard that term, victuals, in a long time, too. Immediately, the slaves attacked the crew, and a furious struggle followed. However, the firearms of the crew prevailed, and the slaves were driven below, but only after 1 Negro had jumped overboard and several had been wounded. These uprisings so unnerved the sailors that several days later, when 4 members of the crew were disabled by illness, the captain reported that a sailor on night watch, imagining that the Negroes were about to revolt again, shot and killed one of them, and on the next night, stabbed another. I want to ask you guys a quick question. When you, earlier in this paper, we talked about the living conditions and the mistreatment and the abuse that our ancestors endured on the slave ship. As we read through this paper, we're reminded, it's like the Killmonger thing, right? Where we are reminded of some folks just chose to jump their ass overboard. Do you guys think you could jump overboard? Talk about it in the chat. I'll read your comments in a few. But do you guys think that you have it in you to jump overboard? In the chat, Gas Them Up is asking Bobby E. Wright, why are the Native American claiming that there's no such thing as a slave trade? P.B. Rodriguez, upon hearing the mention of Barbados, posts the Bayesian flag. Gas Them Up says, we have always had sellouts. I agree. P.B. Rodriguez says there are so many unanswered questions. How many different tribes were trafficked and sold? What tribes were prone to mass suicide? Which ones were more compliant? How did the West Africans grieve for the traffic? Did they ever fight the kingdoms for the raids and betrayal of their countrymen and tribesmen? That's a lot of questions that BB alone is asking. Bobby Wright says there's a banana island in Nigeria and in Sierra Leone. Gas him up says, who knows? Give me liberty or give me death. I pray to have the strength to go overboard. I feel you on that, gas him up. I feel you on that. B. Rodriguez says to gas them up, they sick, the whole lot of them. Gas them up says to BB, the West African and Portuguese sources have many answers. West African and Portuguese sources have many answers. Hope you guys are enjoying the paper tonight. I am. If you're enjoying the paper tonight, drop a 1 or just say what it is that you're enjoying the most about the paper. But again, as always, I appreciate all you guys for being here. All right. This is actually the last paragraph coming up. The foregoing insurrections portray but a single scene in the first act of a mighty drama for freedom, in which African slaves were the principal actors and the New England slave ships the stage. To complete the act, it is necessary to set forth similar struggles aboard other American vessels and the ships of all the other nationalities which participated in the trade. Thus would be told the epic tragedy of battles for freedom fought by millions of blacks on thousands of ships over a span of 3.5 centuries. Such a work, especially for American slave ships, would make a heroic prelude for the second act in the drama, the Negro struggle for liberty on American soil, so admirably set forth by Mr. Aptheker in his splendid volume on American slave revolts, and overthrow completely the fiction that the Negro tamely submitted to enslavement. And that's the end of that paper, but don't leave yet. I want to read this tweet thread to you guys. And again, if you ever, maybe you have some research that you're putting together or what have you, if you ever want any of these papers that I read on the live stream, join the Discord, look up Koku, that's me, of course. Hit me a DM and say, hey, brother, I heard that paper you were reading the other night. Can I get a copy of it? If you don't know how to find it yourself, I'll gladly give it to you, right, as a PDF. But let me read this before we go. Just give me a couple more minutes. This brother, who I guess we started to follow one another after one of the Twitter spaces that we did at KWAZ Radio, with that Oni, I think it might have been, it's either the one that I hosted or one of the two that Oni hosted. He posted this, and I thought it very interesting. He said, this book, he's referring to a book called Black Rebellion in Barbados. Have any of you read this book, Black Rebellion in Barbados, The Struggle Against Slavery from 1627 to 1838 by Hilary Beckles? Right? Beckles is a popular Bayesian surname too. He said, this book has a lot of intriguing information, but one had me astounded when reading it was the opinion of 2 European observers. In Barbados, there was hardly any revolt or plot to revolt in the whole of the 18th century. This phenomenon puzzled Europeans on the island. He goes on to say, and it was argued by majority that the reason why there was no slave revolt or plot to revolt was because of the topography of Barbados. You know, Barbados is like my hometown, no mountains. They didn't have thick bushes at the time, making it hard for maroonage on the island. Additionally, it was argued that it was due to improved militia on the island. 2 European observers on the island posted that it had nothing to do with the topography and improved militia. Rather, it had something to do with the culture of the enslaved Africans changing. They 2 men stated that the enslaved Africans have been Europeanized, as most of the Africans on the island were born in Barbados and not in Africa. To back up their claims, they said, when we defeated the French in the Leeward Islands, the Africans were jubilating. They now see themselves as Europeans, as they have adopted our culture. They also pointed out that Europeans can now walk out at night without fear of being attacked or harmed, unlike in the 17th century, when most of the Africans were African born and were in tune with their culture. They posited that African culture is antagonistic to European domination and rule. And as Africans draw tenets of self determination, freedom, and liberty from their culture or past, but when they adopt European culture, they have no qualms being the subordinate of Europeans. The two men advised planters to stop buying African slaves from Africa, as they are the ones who entice other slaves to revolt or escape. Additionally, they advised planters to make sure all the slaves who still practice vestiges of African culture reject them and adopt European culture. How do you think they did that, by the way? Side note. Let's go back to that religion thing. But to continue, the author of the book then pointed out that around this period that Barbados was calm. Europeans on the islands like Jamaica were catching hell as they still had huge African-born population. The author of this tweet, Esteban Lukumi, adds this. He said, as it was hard for enslaved Africans who escaped to establish settlements and communities in Barbados because the topography made it hard for maroonage, they were constantly in liaison with Africans who worked as sailors and ship crew members, who told them how close other islands were to Barbados. Africans who escaped would make rafts and steal the master's boats and go to St. Vincent. The Native Americans on the island of St. Vincent were known as Caribs. They normally used to return them back to Barbados or sell them to the Spanish or French. So the Caribs were another set of sellouts too. When the Caribs came under attack by Europeans who wanted to seize the island, they stopped returning the Africans to Barbados or selling them. They started regarding them as part of their nation. Barbados Europeans would send expeditions to the island to retrieve the Maroons who withdrew to the mountains and places unable to be accessed and come out at night, ambush the Europeans sent to recapture them and slaughter them. Isn't that interesting? It tells you, just like this paper we've just read tonight, that your African way, your traditional, your original African way, right, was antagonistic to European domination. This is why you see all these uprisings on these ships off the coast of Africa. Or if in America, like in the Rhode Island, New England area, is by folks just coming from the continent. Your proximity to these folks and the time that you spent around these folks and their culture, their indoctrination through their religion, this, that, and the other, has changed you. So when we talk about re-Africanization process, and we talk about, African-centered curriculum and this, that, and the other, it's with good reason. And I hope this tweet by Esteban Lukumi, you guys can, if you follow me on Twitter, you can find my retweet. I retweeted it and I said, what did I say? I retweeted and I said, read this thread and maybe then some of you will understand the need for some re-Africanization. There's a good parallel between that tweet thread and this paper we read tonight. The further you get away from who you used to be, the further you get away from being African, the more lost you are, the more subdued you would be. And you'll never get out of this unless you remove yourself from it. And it starts with, yes, ultimately physically remove yourself, but it starts with removing yourself from the indoctrination camps, called schools and church. Remove yourself from their culture. I mentioned this a little while ago that a lot of black culture, especially here in America, is actually old English, loser culture of the Celts and all these different groups from Britain. Even the way how black folks in America speak, this so-called Ebonics, comes from how these old groups, people groups in England used to speak, and they died off, and so it died off with them in those places, and even here amongst the white folks here. But you're still carrying it on. You got to get back to who you were. In the chat, um, there's been some activity. Gassed him up, said one, he enjoyed the paper. No, I think that's if you enjoyed the paper, type one. Marcus McGee typed one. Tito District says, like in all the examples of African resistance to the slave trade. That's what I'm saying. These things need to be expanded upon. We need to have these stories in our home. You know, this is the true salvation. Bobby Wright says to B.B. Rodriguez, the Igbo who were captured and were known to commit mass suicide, and Africans were kidnapped from all over West Africa, from Senegambia to Angola, and over 500,000 from Mozambique. Gaston says, no, sir. I don't know what the no, sir was for. B. Rodriguez says, yeah, it's Sir Hilary Beckles. Yes. Bobby Wright says to gas them up, what Native Americans? BB says, Bussa, revolted. She shows love for Barbados again. Gas him up says Benjamin Franklin said the same thing. The learning curve is here. That's the revolutionary matron. Y'all say, what's up to the matron, man? What's up to the matron? The matron has tears coming down her emoji faces, right? But BB says Bussa is our Bayesian national hero. Okay. Gas him up says Ben Franklin said when a Native American child was raised by colonists from young, they would return to their tribe after a single conversation with them. Yet whites raised by Native Americans would always flee from the Europeans when they encountered them. Interesting. Bobby Wright type 1, BB has a stare on her face, and then she asks the question, how do I remove myself from my Euro bloodline, though? I'll tell you what you do. First of all, you denounce it. Second of all, you choose, because I know you're married, you choose a mate who is Black African, right? And try to get back, try to get back your bloodline, heavily melanated, right? Try to get it back to what it was, put down their religion and all this other bullshit. KW Don 7 is here saying Saul Booney says he'll catch the replay. Peace to KW Don 7. Appreciate it. Right. Again, make sure you guys drop make sure you guys hit the like button. Bobby Wright says I've read about Bussa and his rebellion, and BB Rodriguez says good evening to the matron. Again, I want to thank all of you guys who tuned in tonight. I'm glad that if not all of you, some of you got something from this reading tonight. I'm going to try to do more of these rebellions type papers on a Tuesday for as long as I could find papers on rebellions, slave rebellions, the rebellions of the enslaved Africans. If you guys know about some material that would be good to read on a Tuesday, let me know. Let me know, and I'll gladly do it. This Sir Beckles book might be something that's a worthwhile read. I'm not sure, but you guys let me know. All right. BB Rodriguez says, denounce Koku? Seriously? I can't deny my love for Mayo, sir. Laughing her ass off. Yeah, you gotta denounce that Mayo too. And the matron says greetings to BB as well. Hey, I appreciate you guys for tuning in tonight. I'll be back. I should be back on Thursday. I missed last week Thursday. I should be back on Thursday on the KWAZ radio side, doing another self-help type topic. So you guys make sure to tune in. And again, Saturday night, Shoot the Breeze. Please. I'm trying to get this to be a little bit bigger, right? If everyone brings 2 people, we could have a damn good Saturday night Shoot the Breeze. It's not like we don't have damn good ones already, but with more people, more conversation, more outlooks, more point of views, it just gets nicer. The more people, the more serious people there are there. So Saturday night Shoot the Breeze. Let's aim. Everyone try bring 2 new people come through. All right. Hope to see you guys then. Gasum up says peace and love, family. Bobby Rice says greetings, KW Don and Matron. I'll see you guys on Thursday on the KWAZ radio side. And again, Saturday we'll be doing Shoot the Breeze. Make sure to post your topics on the Discord. Let's have a good time. All right. You guys be good. I'll talk to you later. Peace and black love.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.